Hello and welcome to the Napoleonic Wars podcast, where Zach White, quite frankly, is reaping what he has sown. Years of jokes about me being an uppity Yank have resulted not only in me taking the lead on the occasional podcast, but also in this case having the temerity of dragging American subjects onto the airwaves. Although in this case, American subjects is a really problematic pair of words. Today we are speaking to Dr. Miriam Leibman, assistant editor of the Adams Papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society, a wonderful place to work if you ever get the chance to do so. And I mean work as in research, not work as be employed there, although that too, I'm sure. And Miriam is fighting the good fight in reminding people that there were women in the American Revolution and the early American Republic, and that they didn't just sit quietly at home sewing flags or twiddling their thumbs or doing anything like that. How are you, Miriam?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you for coming on. And we're also, of course, joined by Zach White,
Who
who's
is looking on in disgust at the fact that I've done 200 of these interviews and about three times a guest has asked me how I'm doing when I introduce them. You've done about two, and you've managed to get somebody caring on the second go. And the first one was me, and I know how you're doing. And frankly, if
yeah,
I pretended to care, it would seem disingenuous.
that
So,
is true.
like why are you getting the preferential treatment?
So what's missing from our listeners and what should be made clear is that there is a little bit of nepotism going on here. Miriam and I have known each other for it's a decade at this point, isn't
It's a
it?
decade.
That's
Is that not
horrifying.
wild?
That's nuts. We went to grad school together. We went through the CUNY Grad Center together. And one of the things that makes the CUNY Grad Center special, and I think we can both agree on this, is that, especially in history, is that we're actually collegial. We're not trying to sabotage each other. We hang out with each other. We're actually like helping. Um, I once had a person in a dissertation seminar that I was in who couldn't make my chapter talk. Um, Physically post me my chapter printed out with comments on it. Like that's the level of help that we give each other, and it is remarkable.
What
So
is
there's
this
But
your
the norm.
madness?
But the norm. That's
it
the
is the
thing.
norm. It is
This
the
is
norm.
insanity. I did a talk on, admittedly, not one of my chapters, but sort of half a chapter. Guess how many people turned up?
Two.
One.
Oof.
Like that's the level of interest that people demonstrate. So inevitably, being sort of terribly British and not wanting to put out the person who made the effort to come in for my talk, I delivered a talk to a room full of one people. Like, so very, very different environments.
You know, the old conference joke is that you're doing well if there's more people in the audience than on the platform. You managed to achieve that with a solo talk, Zach.
Mm,
That's
yes.
impressive.
Yes. All right then.
All
Stop
right.
rubbing it in. For God's
All
sake,
right.
man.
I'm sorry. I'm
Get on with your
sorry.
job.
I Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir. All right. So Miriam, let's start with an overview. Talk us through what American diplomacy looked like in Europe in the early Republic. How formal was it? What were the problems and advantages?
Okay. So before I actually get to that, I'm gonna take a step back and give our audience a bit of information about the Adams Papers because I think it really shapes um, our understanding of diplomacy in this period because the Adamses, John and Abigail Adams and their family were such major players. And so I work at the Adams Papers Project, and we have been around since 1954. The Adams family gave the trust of their papers to the Massachusetts Historical Society, and we have been publishing volumes since. We have three main series in which we publish. The first is diaries, so the diaries of John Adams, of John Quincy Adams, of Charles Francis Adams, and those are published in their entirety. That is part of like what the family has required. Whereas our other editions are select editions. So our second series is Adams Family Correspondence. So it's the family papers and private papers. And this is going to be also where the women of the family's papers are published. And then the third series are the papers of the Adams statesmen. So it's going to be the public papers of John Adams and the public papers of John Quincy Adams. Um, And just to give you an idea of like how much material we're speaking of, so the project runs through 1889. It goes through three main generations of Adamses. Um, and we're talking about 250,000 manuscript pages, which is about 608 reels of microfilm. So it's a lot. And we've been around since 1954. And for the family papers, we're currently finishing up a volume that ends in July of 1809. And for the papers of John Adams, we're currently at work on the volume that covers the second year of John Adams's presidency. So just like to give you a scope and understanding of like how much there is, they had a lot to say. It became kind of like a family project and a family mandate to record um, what in journals, in letter books, in correspondence, what they were seeing, and to also keep it. So they like teach each generation how to like what to do with a letter, like to endorse it and to docket it and to note like notations so that there's a running record of what they're receiving. And also to, maybe you came across this as well, Luke, like numbering your letters, because when they were going across the Atlantic or, you know, early postal service, they would get lost or they'd come in out of order. And so very often a letter will start with, well, I've received 2 and 6, but like not 4 and 5. And so this is something that's like taught to each generation. One of my favorite like little, things before we get into the diplomacy is John Quincy Adams goes with his dad. Well, I guess this is part of the diplomacy. John Quincy Adams goes with his dad to Europe in 1778 or 9. I can't remember off the top of my head, but he's like 12 years old. And he writes to his mom that Abigail Adams, like, oh, Papa tells me to, keep a journal because like I'm seeing all this stuff. He's like, but I'm only 12. Like, I don't care to. And then the best part is that like the best part is when he goes to Russia. So John Quincy will serve as the first U.S. minister to the court of Russia. He goes in July of 1809, and he writes. He and his wife Louisa Catherine Adams, who was a diplomat in her own right as well, leave their 2 eldest children back in Massachusetts with his parents, and he tries to teach his sons who are like 8 and 6 how to do this. So it just continues. But to answer your question about diplomacy in this period, so diplomacy when is happening is like a bit of a mess. Because there's like several factors. Like there's money, right? There's like we need to fund this. And I have not watched enough of the Ben Franklin show to comment on it and Franklin's diplomacy at this time. Episode 2, I think. And so there's the challenge of money, and that will be a very big challenge actually for many women abroad. And we'll get to why soon. There's the challenge of perception and like being accepted by those in Europe as legitimate diplomatic actors, as having official or unofficial titles, as being accepted as not British subjects, right? All of these things are changing and are in flux depending where we are in the war. And then there's like the challenge of like the actual like apparatus of diplomacy, consuls, ministers, etc. So this is not like a period of time where you have like an embassy building and you go and like you have your ambassador, right? Your embassy was your house. There's a very nerdy photo of me going to Grosvenor Square in London, and it's like going to where the Adamses lived, but it was covered in scaffolding, so it's just like me pointing to some scaffolding, but there's like you can't see anything. That was like 6 years ago, so I hope the construction's done. But so that's the first thing. It's like your home was also your diplomatic space, which also meant that people were coming and going throughout your house. It meant that people within your house could constantly hear what was going on. And so in this space, women took on roles in that larger apparatus. So, for example, Nabby Adams, the daughter of Abigail and John Adams, often served as John's secretary while abroad in London. And this meant that she recorded letters in letter books. It means she encoded letters. It means she decoded letters. It means she was like on the staircase listening to him talk with other diplomats about what was going on. So it's a more like porous situation. And in that larger context, because things weren't like so strict, it gave women this space to take these actions, which is very quickly going to come to a close, right? Like by the late 1790s, you're going to have like more consuls, you're going to have, official documents, and it's going to close off avenues for these more unofficial roles. That answer the whole question?
It does, and funnily enough, this is the second evening in a row where I've been recording on the influence of women on history during this period. Last night I was recording with an all-star cast, and one of the things that came up was the role of women in a diplomatic setting. And Beatrice de Graaf was using the case of Dorothea von Leven to use a really pertinent quote that I think exposes a lot about male attitudes to women working in the circle of diplomacy during this period, when the Tsar turns around and says that she would be Russia's greatest diplomat if only she didn't wear a skirt. And of course, Beatrice was making the point, well, no, she was Russia's greatest diplomat, irrespective of wearing a skirt. And we had a discussion, and I'm curious to get your take on this, on whether or not that automatic kind of reflex towards misogyny inevitably leads to men underestimating the scale of women's ability to act as effective agents for their nation in diplomatic circles, which, and that's not really the question. The question is, to what extent does that make the men more susceptible to influence from female diplomats than it does to influence from male diplomats, where they're expecting some kind of diplomatic advance from a man, but wouldn't possibly imagine that a woman could, have the mental capacity to undertake such actions?
100%.
Well, that was
Like,
a
not a
nice,
question.
efficient answer to the,
Not a
the
question.
question.
And I actually think I have some like great examples here. So first of all, like in terms of like American women in Europe, they don't have to fit like the definition of lowercase Republican men. And so while American men are trying to figure out what this line is between what it means to be in a society without a monarch, what it means to see aristocracy and luxury as a vice. And when you try to figure that out, but you're really not thinking about how it applies to women, it gives a space. And it gives a space for women to use the methods of cultivating relationships or writing letters or hosting dinners or sharing information or sharing newspapers go unnoticed, go without concern in the same way. However, there is a line that's too far, because that does happen. There are some women that go abroad in Europe, not necessarily acting as diplomats. Granted, though, in some of these cases, we do not have the archival means to tell their stories. But famously, Abigail Adams and Nabby Adams criticized Anne Willing Bingham for being too luxurious. politics and for showing off too much. So even they were like trying to find this balance. Something though that did not go unnoticed was often these women's letters were sent in diplomatic packets home, so they had like the protection of that coverage, but it also meant their letters were being opened. So they would write things like, I'm not writing about this, or when I see you next, we'll talk about this, because their letters were opened. So there's this weird space of like, even everyone else is trying to figure out where they fit into the diplomatic apparatus and like, how much do they know? How much do they not know? But I also think what's really important is to not place traditional definitions of like, quote, diplomatic history onto what these women are doing, because then it's like taking that misogyny and those preconceived notions and like placing it onto what they're doing. And so one of the things that's actually in my dissertation and now book manuscript, I actually don't rely on men's voices because I want to show like what the women know from their own right and not to discount that by then adding in all these other voices. That being said, right, that larger context is helpful to situate, right, like the larger picture, but we have to be careful to not be like, oh, because they were men in these diplomatic circles, they knew more, so like let's privilege that. Like, no, we need to like privilege these women's voices and like show how active they are, and it shouldn't have to be contingent on what the men knew or what we're doing.
Can I just stay with what you were saying there about where the boundary might lie and the dangers of crossing that boundary? It strikes me as a problem that's handed down throughout history from the medieval period and no doubt before that. If you look at, for example, Matilda in English history, Queen Matilda, the problem for others in society at her time was that she was acting like a male king rather than a female queen. And they had no problem with the idea that Matilda might sort of work as a female king, sort of an elevated version of a queen. But the idea of her acting like a man acts, that was deeply problematic, and they couldn't get behind that. From that, you get a civil war. Obviously, I'm generalizing and simplifying, but this isn't the medieval England podcast. So what I'm curious about is about how these women learn about where that boundary might lie and how they learn to navigate that, because as you're kind of alluding to here, overstepping that mark can be, perhaps dangerous is a little bit melodramatic a term, but it's nonetheless a problem, and that can reduce your ability to operate effectively, because then you've got this reputation as well. You've got to keep clear of person X because she's operating like a male diplomat. This is scandalous. So how do these women kind of learn how to address that issue and make sure that they don't necessarily step over the mark?
They learn from each other. That's what's really interesting. And so my study focuses on 5 women, two of whom are Abigail and Nabby Adams. And so as mother and daughter, right, they have each other to rely on and to learn from one another. Sarah Livingston Jay, and I hesitate to define them by their husbands because their husbands tend to be the ones who are more well known, despite most cases the men marrying up. And so I actually, at least like from in my writing, the ones who are referred to by their last names are the women, and they're also referred to by their maiden names and married names because their life before marriage brought social, economic, political capital. And in some cases, like Nabby Adams marries William Stephen Smith, who has a very interesting story in his own right for maybe another time. When they are going to New York after some time in Europe, John Adams writes her a separate letter of introduction. And so Sarah Livingston Jay, the Livingston family in New York is huge in New York and New Jersey. And so we have to remember that some of them have learned a lot of these methods beforehand because they're in high society in the colonies. They come from money. They are elite. And so how to host a party, they've known how to do that. They've seen that. They've participated in that. What to write home and what not to write home, that's some trial and error. And they figure it out. And what's interesting is they all use similar patterns in their writing. Letters are an art form. One of my favorite things is like at the Adams Papers is Abigail Adams drafts her letters. Like her personal correspondence, there's multiple versions because she writes drafts. And there's like scribble and cross out. They're not streams of consciousness, right? And remembering that women's letters are not streams of consciousness is important because very often we're like, oh, it's family letter. Oh, it's a personal letter. Like they're just going to like write how we maybe write a text message or, we just say what's on our mind, but they're not. Like they're thinking about it so much so that one of the things that you actually I found in all of the women's letters who I wrote about. So just as I realized I didn't give an overview of who else I write about. Sarah Livingston Jay, right, and this is in addition to Abigail and Nabby. Sarah Livingston Jay, Ruth Baldwin Barlow, and Mary Stead Pinckney. When they write about politics in their letters, they often juxtapose it to something about their family or something domestic or fashion or clothing or something that's, quote, traditionally female to hide any kind of politicking. And this is clearly something that's taught, at least among themselves, because it appears in all of their letters. And they're also all aware that their letters are being opened. Ruth Baldwin Barlow tells her husband, when you send me letters, I'm in England, you're in France, you're sending me letters, you have to put them under the cover of someone else. Sarah Livingston Jay gives an example of where she writes to her sisters back home and she's overwhelmed by Marie Antoinette and finds herself getting on her knees and then stops herself because I'm a good American.
Interesting.
I'm sending home clothing for my son. Don't worry, it's in Republican colors.
All right. Well, it's me, so we're going to get back to the fashion portion of this at some point soon. But I do want to stick
lives
with
up to his reputation there.
Damn
So
right.
we have nicknames on this
Yeah.
this show, and unsurprisingly, Luke is now referred to as the Beau.
Some things haven't changed, Miriam. But I want to stick with the letters for a little bit because this is I think this is something that is going to be interesting to both our listeners who are on the academic side and those who aren't. You live and breathe this stuff, right? This is the Adams correspondence and a few other things. Can you talk us through the importance of these networks of correspondence, both as at the time and as current historical sources?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually going to, this is maybe jumping a little bit in one of your questions that you sent me before, but I'm going to talk about both their letters while they're abroad and also later in their lives because some of those habits don't change. So, right, letters are an art form. They draft them. They make changes. And what's actually really cool, so in our volumes, if there's more than one version, we will note the changes. We'll note what gets crossed out. And I should say for all of the listeners, and maybe especially those who are working with the Adamses, if you are, that's great. But also if you teach, all of our almost all of our except for those within the last 2 years of being published, all of our volumes are available online for free. They are like digital versions of our books, so they have all of our footnotes, all of our material, our introduction, all of that, and it's available for free. It's called Adam Paper's Digital Edition, through the Massachusetts Historical Society website, and we recently published online also for free all of John Quincy Adams's diary. He kept a diary for 68 years. And so that's all available online, and it's available as both images of the page and as transcribed. And we have encoded like names so that you can like get IDs of like who's being spoken about. I always love when there's like a good resource available for free. So back to letters. So they drafted their letters. Letters kept them connected to the United States when they went abroad. In cases when these women were in the United States and their husbands may have left to Europe for them, it kept them in connection with their spouses. Right. But also, right, their spouses received letters from the U.S. government, sometimes giving them instructions, right, telling them. Sometimes it was letters of recall, sometimes it was your positions being moved. Right, they also received letters from family and friends, right? It's how they found out about life events, birth, death, right? When you were going to Europe, like it wasn't a summer vacation, you were going for a period of time, right? That journey was no joke. I'm not sure that I would take it if, a ship was my option, in the summer. It took about a month with good weather. They also found out gossip that way. Gossip is political currency, so that was also really good for them. And while they were abroad, and I'm gonna use the example of Abigail Adams. She would write home and she would say, "I'm not writing about politics. I'm not writing about it." And then, of course, she would go on for like several paragraphs about something happening. And then this happens again when she's First Lady in the 1790s. She writes to her sister writes to her, Mary Smith Crant, her sister, quote, "How is it possible for you to take your pen and not write politics? I shall feel myself shut out of the world if I cannot have your opinion how it is going on." Right? So like people relied on her for their political information. And so she wrote back. She said, actually, I should say she wrote this to her other sister, Elizabeth Smith Shaw Peabody. She wrote, quote, "Be cautious to whom you communicate my sentiments. I am not ashamed of them, but perhaps I ought not to write them so freely." So they're aware of this. They know what's going on. And then in retirement, right? So John is done with the presidency, right? He's not really returning to any formal elected political role. And Abigail writes, quote, "I have been so accustomed to write freely upon any subject I chose, that to commit these to paper would have been attributed to different emotions than those which I feel and know actuate my mind." She knew who she was, right? She knew what she said was valued. She knew that it had weight. She knew it could have influence. And so she was careful with what she put to pen.
So jumping off of this, right, and then knowing who you are and sort of in finding that balance, one of the things that I find particularly fascinating in your work, and it has been for the 10 years that we've known each other, God help us, is that it highlights the tension between America as a new nation making its own way, right? You talked about that, the almost bowing to Marie Antoinette and then stopping yourself because you're a good Republican woman. But also at the same time, they're forced to navigate the old world and the old ways, right? Marie Antoinette expected to be bowed and curtsied to. Can you speak a little bit about this and the central role women played in finding that balance?
This tension did take practice. And this tension isn't just aristocratic and Republican. It's also, how do we as Americans now understand our relationship to Britain, right? Because we're going from subject to not, as well as relationship to France, because previously, right, the Americans' relationship to France was predicated on Britain's relationship to France. So it's like this triangle, and like all of it can't be understood without the other, which continues for like a few decades. Um, and this tension will appear at different points, especially like when Abigail Adams and her daughter Nabby like went to go be presented to the king and queen at the court of St. James. She writes that she like censors, for example, part of her reporting on John's introduction to the king and queen. And she quotes the queen's response to John Adams in her letter. But she then writes, in terms of the king, she writes, quote, "The answer of his majesty was much longer, but I am not at liberty to say more respecting it than it was civil and polite, and that his majesty said he was glad the choice of his country had fallen upon him." So after, right, the American Revolution, John Adams served as the first American minister to the court of St. James. So I feel like that's quite a weighty role. But this tension is going to come through of what clothing am I wearing? Where am I shopping? One of my favorite things is like Thomas Jefferson asked Abigail Adams to like do some shopping for him. I think it's hilarious. And like she sends him a bill. The elephant in the room is also that the Americans can't afford to entertain at the level of other European diplomats. And so in some ways, that tension is like gone because they can't. Actually, so much so that the British newspapers are going to not be very nice to the Adamses because they do not have enough diplomatic dinners. But it's also, right, the reason that John Jay and Sarah Livingston Jay came back to the United States from France because they were not willing to go into personal debt to be diplomats, because that's what it would come down to. Abigail Adams is like a good New England woman. She's incredibly frugal. She's incredibly aware of money, right? She has her own money, actually. We can talk about her being a bond speculator at another time. Right? It has her own will. Like these are like very smart financially. And even she's like, I can't entertain, I can't throw these parties, I can't do these gifts that it's expected of me because it will bankrupt me or cause me to go into debt. And I feel like debt's a bad pattern, especially among like some founding members of the United States. Right, like famously Thomas Jefferson.
But also, isn't this where we kind of end up inadvertently well, perhaps not inadvertently, doubling back to the misogyny of the era? So apologies to sort of cut you off mid-flow here. Bad podcasting, but regular listeners are used to this by now. But I feel as though if a man gets into debt, a man gets into debt. If a woman gets into debt, oh dear, you know, Josephine spending so much money on like lavish dresses and hats and the rest. And yes, Josephine loved to spend money. Nobody's denying that. However, have you seen some of those hats and some of those dresses? You would spend that money on them if you were any kind of self-respecting human being.
Yeah. Marie Antoinette the same.
Yeah.
And I just kind of wonder if that also has a factor to play in here, that as a woman, you've got to be much more careful with your finances because, inverted commas, respectability. Yet if a man gambles his way, well, actually, if a man gambled away his fortune, he would be frowned upon by society, I guess. But it would be seen as
But there's a level
deal.
there's a level that you can do it to and still be normal.
Yes.
And I guess like a couple of clarifying points that I think is really important is one, because these women come from means, they have money that is separate from their spouses, which is not the norm in this period, right? And like coverture laws, right, would also prevent some of that as well. And so I think like how many many, right? Abigail, there's a reason that people look at Abigail Adams as and study her as a bond speculator, because one, we have great documentation, but two, right, her status, right, allows her to do that. An example also, right, in terms of this gender dynamic to it is, so Sarah Livingston Jay, her brother Brockholst Livingston goes to Europe with them, and he spends a ton of money, but like nobody's worried about him spending money, because the vice that was actually that people were concerned with about men had to do with gambling, as opposed to shopping, which I think is really interesting. So people would be like, oh, young Americans, don't go to Europe, you'll fall for the vices of Paris. And like they comment on like, oh, the French on the Sabbath, they don't rest. Like they're at the parks, they're wearing makeup, like they're feasting. Right. So there's definitely like a religious component to this as well. And like for some of them, being in a Catholic country for the first time, like also is a unique experience. But the other thing that is not to be forgotten, and is the case for many of these women who go abroad, and granted, right, we are looking at a privileged group of women, is their moms, right? Their mothers. In some cases, they're giving birth, they're raising children, they're marrying off kids. Abigail Adams her daughter Nabby will get married while they're abroad in Europe, and will become a grandmother. Right, Sarah Livingston Jay is like actively having children while in Spain and then in France. Americans who go to Paris are very good friends with the Lafayettes and bond over the fact that the Lafayettes named their daughter Virginia as representing the bond between the United States and France. Like it's like these like ideals are like literally embodied, like in bodies, like in these children, right? There's like concerns about what happens if your kid speaks better French than they speak English, right? Like what happens? They're like thinking about allegiance, and they're thinking about what does it mean to be a citizen of the United States when you're abroad, and in some cases might have spent more time abroad than in the United States. So I think that goes a little off the question.
I'm reminded of those wonderful sort of Puritan names that we encounter, sort of hope and chastity and all of that, and penitence and patience. Um, all right, damn it, I've waited long enough. It's me. I have to ask this. Yeah, fashion, opulence, material culture. They all play a big role in this, and especially in that sort of, becoming, it's almost an American version of going native, right? That horrifying idea of 19th century British Empire of becoming too much like the Indians, or something like the Indian subcontinent. So this plays a big part in this. So let's talk silk and luxury and good English wool, and how that was something of a double-edged sword.
Can I just say that is the most you question we will have on this podcast, possibly ever.
Well, I am working on those 2 episodes on men's and women's fashion in the period, so that
Why
record may not hold.
why did I sign off on those and let you do the questioning on that? That was just asking for it, wasn't it? Sorry, Miriam. Welcome to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where we are highly professional individuals.
Oh my word.
So, right, clothing and fashion and silk have like many functions, right? There's the to wear, to gift, to send home. Um, right, one of my favorites is like Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson like exchanging shopping lists, which I just think is like great. Um, Thomas Jefferson also asked Abigail Adams for financial advice, didn't seem to listen, ended up in debt. Not great for him. But fashion, right, was really politicized, right, as you I'm sure know, Luke. Um, and it's not just politicized in terms of like luxury, but it's also in terms of like relation to Britain and France. And so, right, as Kate Hallman, who has a great book on fashion in the 18th century, right, this will even like come out in like style wars between Federalists and Democratic Republicans in the 1790s. And actually in the volume we're working on the papers of John Adams, it's like height of like XYZ affair, quasi wars coming, and there's a like a black cockade fever that they describe. Um, and it's like and then it will like turn into like a tricolor fever to like push back, and it's like it's great. Well, like not like the war part, not great, but like the fashion part and like using clothing to right to show your political allegiances. Fascinating.
Can I just say we are having a fashion wars episode? That's got to
Without
happen.
question. Without question.
You are coming back for one of those. Like that's yes.
That's
yeah.
That sounds
yeah.
lovely to say.
It's time for the fops versus dandies duels.
That's amazing.
Sorry, we put you off your stride, not for the first time in this episode.
Probably not for the last. If you want, when you come back, you can stipulate that one of our other team members interviews you. It's sort of, I want nothing to do with those two idiots.
As I was saying, clothing. So one of my a really great example is Sarah Livingston Jay while in I want to say it's when she's in Spain, sends clothing home for her son. And I've mentioned this example. And she's like, yeah, it's the exact same outfit. Oh, no, sorry, it was France. It's the exact same outfit that Dauphin was wearing, but in Republican colors. And I'm just like, what's Republican colors? Which, if anyone has an answer to, I'm still looking for the answer. So please let me know. And then this will also be the case for, and this is a bit later. So this is like when Ruth Barlow is in France for the second time. Joel Barlow serves as the U.S. minister, and Dolly Madison tasks her to go shopping. And Dolly Madison is like known as like the Queen of America. And she asked for this is a great list. Large headdresses, a few flowers, feathers, gloves, and stockings, black and white, or any other pretty thing suitable to an economist, and draw on my husband for the amount. So there's a whole list, and then it's like, bill my husband the president, thank you very much.
But also, please send flowers. That's the one I'm scratching my head about. Like, I am not a great horticulturalist. It will shock people to hear. But even an idiot like me knows that they're not going to last. Like, flowers are very perishable. So unless you're transporting them in a block of ice, you're going to have problems.
It's the bulbs and seeds, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, I see. I was starting to think, is it dried flowers? Like, and do you press them and stuff like that?
For more on that, have an episode with Sophie Tunney.
Yeah. French horticultural history.
Yeah. And like the royal gardens and like bringing plants from all over the world and the empire.
Yeah.
But like purchasing clothing from France in a moment when the War of 1812 is happening, like that has like weight, right? Like, oh, right, like we can't buy things from England, or are we choosing to? Because also, right, in this moment of in the lead up to the War of 1812, right, like you have the embargo. And so for both Britain and France. And so you also have this like kind of like pre-revolutionary moment again where like women are sewing clothing. My favorite is Nabby Adams is living in like on a homestead in central New York that her husband bought. And she's like making maple sugar because they're not importing sugar. So she's like writes to her mom about like how to make this. And so like it continues on, right? This tradition continues on. Right. And it continues right to today, right? Like how many maybe not you, Zach, but like Luke, do you often read the article after the State of the Union about like what the first lady wore or
Yeah.
what the second gentleman wore?
Yeah.
Because that had, or like what happened after a state dinner, like what did someone wear? Because like who's designing your dress and what color it is matters,
Yeah.
right? It's like a form of politics. Like, are you wearing an American designer? Are you not? Right. And the same thing is happening here. Like, the same thing is happening here. Um, and right, they will buy clothing while they're in France to fit with the fashion. Um, they they go shopping plenty. They go to the theater. Um, they do they do learn what the practices and cultures and customs of the society are, with the big caveat of never think anybody at home thinks you've become one of them.
Hmm.
Right? Like you always have to, and that's the thing, right? That appears in the letters, right? And why they draft them and why they're so careful. And this thing that happens in every single women, right? Each of these women's letters is they're always juxtaposing it with something that is either traditionally, like stereotypically feminine, or something with America, so that it never seems like they've gone too far.
Mm.
They're always on that line. They're always on that road. And like one of my this is also pretty great. When John Adams goes to Europe, he takes John Quincy, but their other children are at home, and he tells Abigail, teach our kids French, right? Like French is the language of diplomacy. Teach them French. They need to know how to speak French. And like you know better French than anyone I know. And then when they go to Europe, when Abigail goes to Europe, she's like, I don't want to speak French. I don't know it. I don't know how to converse with these ladies. So did she forget how to speak French? Granted, as someone who used to speak fluent French, and it's definitely rougher these days, I totally understand that. But this is Abigail Adams, so like I don't think that's that. I think it's like, two things. One, I have a terrible accent, so maybe I don't want to let that on. But maybe more likely, if these women don't and men don't realize that I speak French, I can learn so much more.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Right. And there's your question about like underestimating what women can do. If she doesn't let on that she speaks French, everyone knows her husband speaks French. He's been in Europe for a while. He's been going through several different courts, several different countries. Nobody knows her.
That is brilliant, and it's the level of tactical thinking that you would expect from Abigail Adams.
Oh,
Uh,
never underestimate her.
no,
Ever.
never, never. So I just wanted to jump in on this on this whole idea of the Republican colors, because this is fascinating to me. Because it
Um,
could
uh,
go ahead, Zach.
yeah, I'm gonna be annoying and interrupt you because it's what I do. Um, so the Republican colors, obviously, you two are probably more steeped in like the history or lack of on this than I am. But my initial reaction was, well, Republican colors, would that be red, white, and blue? But then I also kind of went, well, yeah, but the Union flag that's developing over this period is also red, white, and blue. So it's not very Republican. And so I text Luke about this midway through because we have like an ongoing conversation where we run the interview in the background. And he was like, well, yes, but also you're being a bit of an idiot because maybe it's like browns in there. So what's the thinking on what Republican colors might be? Is there like a range, or is it just the rainbow is your range of colors? Because it could be anything.
I don't know. This has like actually been a question that I've been working on for years. Like I spoke to someone, I once like at a conference met someone who was a fashion historian. And but like they didn't know the answer. I wonder if it's something that doesn't cost as much to produce. I wonder if, if traditionally monarchs wore reds and purples, maybe it was just like not reds and purples. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know
Yeah.
because
My instinct would be I like the costs less to produce. And it would make sense that those like the homespun colors that came out of the conspicuous non-consumption, conspicuous local consumption of the young ladies in town era. The other thing that I think might be worth looking into on this is, and Zach, you may not be aware of this, but before Uncle Sam, we had Brother Jonathan. He was the symbol of the United States. And I'd be curious. I know there's at least one caricature of him wearing black and white, the one where he's giving George III a bloody nose, in the War of 1812. But I'd be curious if there what he's depicted at in other representations, what he's wearing. Might be an
Yeah,
idea.
that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so staying with the Republican theme, one of the things that I will be honest, when Luke said, "Yeah, we need to talk about this," I went, "Yeah, but what is that?" Um, so so therefore we changed the question to encapsulate the what is that of the Republican court. So what was that? But also perhaps more interestingly, once we've dealt with like the fact that I don't know what I'm talking about in this episode, um, how does it involve and what's its significance? But then I'm going to add another layer to this. How do these women shape the Republican court? What is their role within it, and how do they not only navigate it but also kind of shape the way that it operates?
So the Republican court it comes out of um, George Washington and Martha Washington hosting um, men and women in an intellectual space to talk about politics, to meet, to socialize, to gather. Think about it as like a levee meets a salon. And this was the primary space for American women to um, engage in political activity in the early capital cities. So it will exist in New York and in Philadelphia and in Washington, D.C. Um, it is an elite space. It will continue during the presidency of John Adams. Abigail Adams will host it. And it was right this space where men and women came together and to meet and socialize and talk politics. And, Abigail Adams could, have a conversation with Timothy Pickering, who was John Adams's Secretary of State until he fired him. Great story. So the Republican court actually it's what's really interesting about it is that it's going to go away almost as soon as it appears, because when Thomas Jefferson becomes president, he's going to shut it down. So, and this is what where like the historian Rosemary Zagari sees the backlash towards women's political activity begin, and right ultimately culminates with the election of Andrew Jackson and universal white male suffrage. Right, like this is right, like when the Republican court comes about is the era when like single landowning women in New Jersey can vote. Right, like that's a fun fact. So it's a space where, as the political parties are developing, as Federalists and Democratic Republicans are forming their ideas and coalescing their parties and their platforms, right, women are involved because it's happening in these spaces. And so it basically blends like court society and republicanism, right? It's taking that tension that existed abroad, bringing it back to the United States and saying, smush, we're putting it together, right? So it's saying, how do we deal with the tensions abroad? We're going to now figure it out here. And so I see American women diplomats in Europe in the 1780s and 1790s as the precursor to the Republican court, because they're going to take what they learned and they're going to bring it here, and they're going to have this space where they can influence, inform, learn, gather intelligence, and then bring it home with them, right? Because like in capital, right? That's the thing also is, right, capital cities in this period is not like today, right? Congress was not in session all year long. You went home, you had another job. So like you brought that information home with you and then you brought it back, right? And so these spaces exist for a very short period of time. Dolly Madison will bring it back for a bit, as will Louisa Catherine Adams. But then it will close off. And actually I see it as it then turns into women becoming really involved in like reform societies in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. Right. And that's like the larger trajectory of it, right? Because like women will have to funnel their political activities into like these like socially acceptable ways of doing it that aren't just we're gonna wear our black cockade in support for John Adams and show up in the crowds when the young men of Philadelphia present John Adams with a patriotic address and uniform. But like we have to go do it in a way that is now right socially acceptable.
So is it referred to as, I mean, I suspect this is not the case, but is it referred to as kind of the term Republican Court? Is it from the time, or is it a historical kind of a shorthand for this kind of episode that you're talking about that sort of comes in and then has sort of legacies and influences and then sort of goes away and comes back? And where does the term come from?
So there's this book, I'm trying to find the title of it, that was published in the 19th century called The Republican Court by Rufus Wilmot Griswold. And it's the Republican Court or American Society in the Days of Washington. And so it's written about in that book. And then in the 1990s, two historians presented a series of papers at a conference bringing this history back. And then those were published in like a special edition of the Journal of the Early Republic in 2014. And it goes through like, what did it look like under the Adamses? What did it look like under Washington? What happened with Jefferson? And it is often part like of like the resurgence of early Republic women's history.
Okay. Now you've actually touched on this a little bit already, but I do want I want it to have its own moment. I want to have its own question because this is bloody important. So just really and hammer this home, Miriam. The experiences of these women shape the evolution of American politicking and diplomacy for the next 50, 100, 150 to this day, to a certain extent. We're talking about the fashion, right? Now, in certain cases, Jefferson to a certain extent, Jackson, absolutely. They don't want to acknowledge this. But really, just break it down for us, right? Like, prove it.
Prove what they did, prove
Yeah,
the
no,
importance.
basically just sort of like show us how the experiences of these women shape the evolution of American politicking and diplomacy.
Can I just be the unprofessional voice in the room for a moment here and just say that is a sublime moment that I'm going to clip and play back to Luke on occasion when I need to bring him back down to earth? Like the moment that you asked a scholar on the influence of women in American history to prove the influence of women on American history.
I didn't mean it in that way, and you damn well know it.
Have you
No.
ever known me to take anything you say out of context and use it in a vexatious manner, Luke?
I've never known you to do anything but that.
Precisely.
But no, Miriam, like, imagine someone who's just logging into this podcast now, in which case I wholeheartedly apologize to whoever's listening. Give us the 5 minute why this matters, why this is important. Is that better, Zach?
I mean, you've basically asked a PhD to answer the so what of their PhD. Like I can continue to piss you off on this front all day. It is a really important question, actually. If you hadn't asked it, I would have done, but I can get away with taking the piss out of you for it, so I'm going to. But we should actually let our guest answer the question because that is kind of the point of podcasts.
As entertaining as this was, so I think I'm going to answer it backwards. Okay, it was really, really, really important. It had a huge influence. I'm going to tell you why. But first, I'm going to say I don't think most people know about most of these women. Um, I didn't even know about some of them when I started my PhD program. I think that is a product of archives. I think it's a product of whose archives are kept, whose are not, right? One of my, very often when I would go through an article and you can see sources and you'd see papers of this person and papers of that person. And right, in the case of, let's say, Ruth Baldwin Barlow, right, her papers are in Joel Barlow's papers, right? How does the archive itself cover these women, right? Who were covered by Covered Her Laws, who were covered by the archive, who were maybe their James Monroe burned most of his wives' letters. George Washington burned most of his, right? Like most of Martha Washington's letters have been burned. So one, we need to like think about like why? Why don't we maybe know about this? Why hasn't this history been told? Why do people know about the founding fathers but not the founding mothers? And I think right, this goes like also about like the power dynamics of an archive and right, like whose voices are told, and right, why we often have the voices of those that are elite and in power and not those that are oppressed, right? And like it really allows us this moment to think about whose history gets told and whose doesn't. And actually, very often in graduate school, I was asked about studying elites. I was asked about studying those in power. And I said, we need to, if we want to understand how power works, we need to understand those who are in power. And right, like Mary Stead Pinckney was an enslaver, right? And that doesn't discount that, right? We have to contend with that. Sarah Livingston Jay, right? Had an enslaved woman with her in Paris and had her put in jail and she died, right? Like we need to, right? These women had power in society. Even when, right, maybe others in society didn't see them as having power. And so I think we need to realize that. And I think right, there's been a lot of more work actually on that recently in the last 10, 15 years. I think we could look at modern politics and see how politicians' families are drawn into things to understand maybe why the family of diplomats or of presidents in history's past, to learn this, right? I don't think it's such a like, politicians running mates are vetted, right? Because right, and that's not just about politician, it's right about their history, it's about their family members. And the same thing goes for these women, right? Like they were figuring out what it meant to be American. They actively contributed what it meant to be American, figuring out what it meant to be a citizen of this new country and what their role in it was to be. They defined maybe one of the most influential positions in this country, which is First Lady. Right? Like think about how we talk about First Ladies now as having their own legislative agenda or cause that they try to push and maybe and get legislation passed and inspire, or a cause or a project, right, that they take on. And we also have ambassadors, and that role is shaped by this early version of it, right? It's maybe we learned that you shouldn't have your embassy in your house, but like, we also learned about gift giving and, what's too much of a gift, right? Like, when is a gift bad, right? Like, or what gifts can't we give? Or I even think about how, like, we now have, right, like in the last, right, I think it started in the 70s, like we have like animal diplomacy, we have food diplomacy, right? Like all of this is being crafted in this period. And I think we're often so focused on the early United States as like being domestic and figuring out like, or like George Washington and like, we're not going to get involved in entangling treaties. But, like, we're actually really freaking entangled. Like, we never stop being entangled. And it's going to come through clothing, through food, through political information. And like, you know who's doing that? The women. You know, women are sending newspapers from abroad to home and clothing from home to abroad and food. Abigail Adams is going to send, I want to say it's like cheese that's like not allowed to be sent into the United States because of like taxes. And she's like trying to evade that. Like, you can't understand modern diplomacy and all of its practices and faux pas without looking at what these women were doing. You can't.
There it is. That's what I wanted.
So aside from learning about the history of tax evasion and cheese through the
Hey,
course
hey,
of your
hey, hey, hey.
studies,
These are crucial subjects.
I'm not dismissing them, but it wasn't quite where I expected us to go with this episode. What I want to ask in all seriousness, though, is about where the historiography would benefit from going next, if you see what I mean. You know, what would it be? I'm not pretending that we've got a whole bunch of PhD prospective folks listening to this, but in terms of, you know, ideas and interesting things that would be obvious next steps to explore, what would your suggestion be? And equally, you know, feel free to talk about what you are working on, and where you see your research going.
One of like the best things about working with the Adams papers is you just like learn new information all the time. And so if anyone does need a dissertation topic, I like have a running list. I think it's like up to 20 things now. Because it just like that was a thing. Like, I didn't know about that law. I didn't know about that tax. I didn't know about that person. Like, there's James Wilkinson, who like was a general in the US Army. Like, somehow, so he's like a Spanish spy, but he convinces 4 American presidents that he's not. So, like, wild stuff happening in the early republic. Like, wild stuff. I don't think people realize how wild it is. Um, and how much is like being figured out, and like the apparatus of government and the institution of government. And like you even see over the course of John Adams's presidency how like how vast the federal government becomes. Like, it's wild to watch. Um, so, but I would say actually is look at, first of all, Abigail Adams in retirement. Always look at Abigail Adams in retirement. She's a badass. Which reminds me, I have so many Napoleon things that I haven't even gotten to talk about yet. So I think we should go there soon. But
Oh, don't worry. There'll be we've discussed this already. There's going to be a follow-up episode. You might even get a series at this point. Like that's happening. But please carry on.
excellent, here for it. Um, I get questions all the time when I was on a podcast last summer, and I get questions all the time when it's like the next one's going to happen. So like I was able to make a lot of people very happy in the last week. Um, but I think for example, look at the US and France and Britain because I saw that as like an incredibly important power dynamic, and that really guided my research. That along with like what archives are available, right? Because in the case of women, right, it's often elite women, and right, there are even some women who are elite that I want to write about, and it was just it was impossible because of just what is available. So, but actually, I would also look at where else are diplomats going in this period, and who's going with them, wives, children, what's happening in Latin America. I think the US's relationship with Spain in this period is completely understudied. Um, I from a diplomatic perspective, also like I think Barbary powers, there's so much to learn there. Um, and um, there's also loyalists, right? So there's loyalists that go to England after the American Revolution, and Abigail Adams meets with many of them, and I think learning about them would be fascinating, because there's like these expat communities in Europe, right, from this period, even before this period. Like Mary Stead Pinkney, like grew up in London for part of her childhood, and Louisa Catherine Adams, right, who right is from London, right, grew up in Nantes during the American Revolution, right, because they were on the side of the patriots, so they had to leave England, and so they went to France, and so like I think there's like space to map these communities. And I think now actually with like DH technologies, like there's the ability to do that. Like one of the things I did when I was in London is like I walked the path, right? Like from the Adams's home to the court of St. James and like where they were talking about, like, right, trying to get into their footsteps. Um, and I think that'd be a really cool walking tour. Do the same for Paris. Right. Like there's plaques all over both of those cities with like mentions of Americans doing things. Um, and I think there still is this real, like, at least with France, there's this real fascination with like the relationship between the United States and France. I think so much more can be done on the Marquise de Lafayette, Adrienne Lafayette, the the badass that the Marquis married, because like let's define it that way. Um, like he married up. She's the one with the money. Like so like I think her relationship with like digging into her papers and her relationship with American women really has a lot of potential. And I think there like there's always pockets of people like underratedly like a lot of these like more radical like groups that are going to appear in the aftermath of the French Revolution, right? So like those associated with like Thomas Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft, like they all become like friends. And I think and Americans get involved that way. And I think that's like a really interesting avenue as well to like understand the age of revolutions. And some people have done work on this, like Janet Pulaski, for example. But I think there's more there because like there's going to be so much fear in the United States in the 1790s of like one turning into like the reign of terror that happens in France, but also like French invasion in the 1790s and then like British invasion and like don't even get me started like what's happening on the seas because like it's insane. Like I would not want to be on a ship like anywhere near the 1790s. So
And
much impressed me.
and there you have it. At least a dozen book and dissertation ideas, tax evasion, cheese, flour, silk, Republican colors, just what they were and how they were made, and above all, how women designed and shaped American politics and diplomacy, not just in a new country, but today and beyond. Miriam, thank you so much for joining us and putting up with us, even more so. We would genuinely love to have you back. The Unvarnished Atoms on Napoleon, Style Wars, just what's happening on the seas. Uh,
So let me give you a little like preview. So around the election of 1800, um, Abigail Adams describes Aaron Burr this way. I believe he would become a Bonaparte if he could. He is bold, daring, nothing to lose of property or reputation, ambitions, insinuating, a voluptuary in practice, and as to religion, I do not think he feels any restraints from it.
there you have it.
But she doesn't stop because in her retirement with Mercy Otis Warren, who writes a history of the American Revolution that John Adams like cannot stand, and so their friendship ends for a period of time. I was working on this earlier, so it appeared. And Mercy Otis Warren wants to know what Abigail Adams thinks of Napoleon, right? So this is 1807. So like that's also the thing is Napoleon is everywhere in these volumes. They are constantly talking about him. And so Abigail, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. She's like, okay, so you asked like what John thinks of Napoleon, but like if you asked me and what I think of him, I can't answer for my husband. My answer shall be as prompt and frank as her question. Napoleon's maker alone can tell all he was made for. In general, Napoleon was, I will not say made, but permitted for Cat o' nine tails to inflict 10,000 lashes upon the back of Europe as divine vengeance for the atheism, infidelity, fornications, adulteries, incest, and sodomies, as well as briberies, robberies, murders, thefts, intrigues, and fraudulent speculations of her inhabitants. And if we are far enough advanced in the career, and certainly we have progressed very rapidly, to whip us for the same crimes, and after he has answered the end he was made or permitted for, to be thrown into the fire. Now I think I have merited the answer from Mrs. Warren, which she has promised me to the question, what was Napoleon made for? And that's coming out in our next volume in 2025.
I mean, nobody's ever tried to turn a quote into the anthem for a podcast. But if we were ever to attempt that here on this show, that would be a leading contender, along with Beatrice de Graaf remarking that Napoleon was a misogynistic prick. If you are a pro Bonapartist, then sort of sorry, but not really sorry, because these quotes are sublime. Miriam, wow, thank you so much. Folks, you've been listening to the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. Hello again, folks. As the festive season approaches, why not spread the festive cheer in one of a few ways? Firstly, reviews. Most of you probably listen to this when you're in the car, so can't do anything when you hear our pleas to leave a review. If you're listening to this at home during the festive season, though, there's a chance that you can reach straight for your phone. So head to Apple Podcasts, leave a review and a comment. It costs you nothing. But if every single one of the 2,000 people tuning in each week did it, we'd be one of the top-rated shows in Europe. Please, if you appreciate the free content, give us 30 seconds in exchange for the hundreds of hours of material we give you. Looking for a Christmas gift? Got Christmas money to burn? Head over to the Napoleonic Wars pod shop on Printify, we'll put a link below, and get your hands on the Now Napoleonists, Now's Your Time mug, the Secretary at Home t-shirts, and a host of other merch. Want a personalized hoodie? We can provide that. Get in touch with us at napwarspod@gmail.com. You have a Napoleonicist in your life? Are they gagging for access to our socials, our online course, or exclusive behind-the-scenes access to our interviews? Well, you can now gift a Patreon membership to the show. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out more. Prices start from £2 a month, and excitingly, we are doing a Patreon giveaway. Anyone who is a member of our Exploring Officers, Mentioned in Dispatches, or Admirals tiers on Patreon on the 21st of December 2024 will automatically be entered into a prize draw. The winning 3 will be given free access to the full Legion to Scholar experience for the month of January, from the online course to the behind-the-scenes access to interviews and the Meet the Author experience. To enter, just be signed up as an Exploring Officer, Mentioned in Dispatches, or Admiral Patron by the 21st of December 2024, and if you win, we'll let you know in time for Christmas. Shout outs to all of our patrons. In the Mentioned in Dispatches tier, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Ruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, the enigmatically named Zed, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion to Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. Merry Christmas, my friends. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves. Have a great festive break. Stay well, enjoy the mulled wine, and as always, thank you for listening.